Well, let's move to another take on this whole debate, which is how much Western communities understand of the East. And the word Orientalism. Orientalism being the study of the East and Arabic in the West. And perhaps, surprisingly to many people, an enormously controversial subject in academia and in politics. Robert Irwin, you've written a book, Orientalism, which at one level is, I don't mean this in it's dry in the sense of it's an analytical study of the extraordinary people and the history of the study of Arabic and coins and the communities and traditions and histories of the East by Westerners, be they French or British. And yet it's also a very aggressive book indeed. You start off at the beginning of this book basically saying that this is an attack on Edward Said, the very well-known, now deceased academic. Just explain to us, first of all, why Orientalism is controversial.
Well, it never occurred to me when I started working in the field back in the 60s in the history of medieval Egypt and Syria, Islamic art, the Arabian Nights, classical Arabic literature, that I was doing something dangerous, disreputable, potentially pro-Zionist and imperialist. But then Edward Said, the cultural critic, the Palestinian spokesman, produced that famous or perhaps notorious book Orientalism in 1978. In which he denounced the whole tradition of the study of Islam and the Arabs and attitudes to the East. He went all the way back to Homer and Aeschylus and then through the Middle Ages and through Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt up to modern times, attacking a whole range of academics who'd worked on Arabic and Persian and the study of Islam. And he'd made them accomplices of imperialism and racism. And when I looked at the stuff, I thought, this is nonsense, this is not my experience, these are not the Orientalists I know. They have to be defended.
So it was, from your point of view, it was almost as if Moshe Dayan's tanks had a kind of Oxford numismaticist, if that's the word, it probably isn't, sitting on each fender.
Yeah, I mean, it's an idea that somebody who's writing a history of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th and 9th centuries is an accomplice of sort of imperialism and is very useful to British generals in the Middle East and sort of rubber planters.
And this was because, in his argument, Oriental scholars were somehow downgrading, infantilizing the culture of the East.
Well, he misrepresents individual Orientalists quite seriously. And I think the problem with Edward Said, who's in many ways, I must say, an admirable man, an excellent writer, is that he was an academic and he does overvalue the importance of academics and intellectuals in politics. I think he should have been attacking politicians, the Zionist lobby, arms merchants, journalists, but to attack Orientalists, it just seems firing off in the wrong direction.
And let's just turn to some of these characters, because it is an extraordinary tradition. It goes right back to trying to understand biblical times by understanding the connections between Arabic and Hebrew.
Yeah, I think the absolute basic truth about Orientalism is if you go back to the Middle Ages, then our image of Islam and what the Arabs and Turks were doing was formulated by churchmen and scholastics and chroniclers, and they produced an extremely malevolent and mendacious portrait of the Prophet, and they had his coffins suspended by magnets as a sort of pseudo-miracle in Mecca, and they had the Prophet training a pigeon to sit on his shoulder and send him, so the Prophet could pretend that this was the Holy Spirit giving him messages. All sorts of nonsense like this, and they claim that the Muslims actually worship Muhammad. And it's the Orientalists from the 16th century onwards, actually going back to the source, actually reading the Quran and comments on the Quran, who start to get things right.
And translating the Quran, of course, as well. Yes. And you make the point, interestingly, that this starts to happen not at a time when the Orient, as it were, been defeated, but far from it, when the Muslim hordes are at the gates of Vienna.
Yes, I mean, this goes on right until the 17th century. It's not just the Ottomans advancing through the Balkans to, as you say, threaten Vienna and occupy Cyprus and so on, but it's also the Barbary Corsairs. Thousands of British people went into slavery every year in North Africa, captured by the Corsairs. They used to raid off the coast of Britain. And so Europe was feeling rather vulnerable and looking desperately for friends in the world, because it felt as though it was completely surrounded by Islam for a long time. The tide only begins to change in the 18th century, and people are slow to realise that.
And should we listen to the Orientalists more now?
I think we should.
You're an Orientalist, you were going to say that.
Well, yes. But Yeah, I think, for example, the Iraq War, if people read less of the crisis-driven books, which are about Taliban and suicide bombers, they come out in great rushes, sort of according to each crisis, and read more about the actual background of Iraq and its tribal politics and its rural politics and the way deals used to be done by the Ba'ath Party, we'd have had a much better understanding of what we were blundering into a few years ago.
Hallie.
I think my problem with the argument that you have is the presentation of the Orientalists as these lovely fuddy-duddy intellectuals, you know, who are raised in boarding schools where they go to mass.
Nothing wrong with Tweed.
Exactly. But I think what we have to accept is that all of that constructs a baggage, and nobody has an objective intellectual perspective on what they look like. I mean, we are even beginning to think that scientists don't have, so let alone social scientists. And when we actually look at some of the people that you write about, you know, the ambition is that it will be the Protestants who will conquer the Muslims. Now, here is an Orientalist that you quote, who's writing in order to understand Islam, in order to conquer them. Now, you know, it's okay. But, I mean, the other worry that I have is that all the Muslims actually are not good scholars. They don't understand their history. So I think there's a kind of assumption which is problematic.
Obviously, in my book, I'm not arguing that the Orientalists are objective. Quite the contrary. Each generation brings its own prejudices to the subject. But what I'm saying is that there isn't a single prejudice. There are clashing views. There's sort of a Victorian approach to Islam, which is quite different from the Edwardian one, and so forth. And, well, another thing, actually, yes, there are a lot of... I do list rather a lot of Arab scholars, and one of my complaints about Orientalism is that Edward Said complained that the Arabs were not allowed to represent themselves, that they didn't publish, they didn't hold senior academic posts. It's not true. It's particularly not true in the United States, which is where most Orientalists are these days. Britain is rather winding down in this field.
Robert, well, first of all, I completely agree with you that we should be better armed with more knowledge of the Middle East and especially the history, where I think you're right. There's too many books about the sort of sharp shop of the war rather than the background. But I just wanted to make a comment about Edward Said. While, again, I agree with you in many ways, his work is littered with errors. In particular, when his autobiography came out a few years ago and it was exposed as various things being completely wrong, I do think in many ways what he was a voice for the Palestinian people who really don't have a voice or a representation other than, say, Hanan Ashrawi or Saïb Erekat, who are political people. In many ways, he was a voice for people that are otherwise presented as terrorists. I mean, look at Spielberg's new film, Munich, in which they're seen as, bloodthirsty killers. And so Said, when he died, of course, was elevated to the status of sainthood. But I think in that respect, he did give the Palestinian people a face and a voice.
Yes, and it was a very good face. I have no quarrel with that. I like what he's written about Palestine. Yes, it's just sad that he wasted, in my opinion, so much time on Orientalism.
Yeah. It strikes me that reading what was written about your book and the sort of condensation, because I've not actually read your book, which I will do afterwards, I promise.
It's over 400 pages.
It's okay, I'm quite quick. But isn't it the case that a lot of this is all to do with polarization? All the Orientalists were bad, all the Orientalists were good, and that this kind of, it becomes also this sort of entrenched thing, that it becomes like a myth, then debunk the myth, and could a criticism not be levelled about your book that it's just an alternative counter? It's just a counter to the book that came before, almost waiting for another Said to come along afterwards and then try and knock it back the other way.
I think I've been pretty fierce at looking at Orientalists' agendas, particularly modern ones. I make it clear that Bernard Lewis writes the way he does for a reason, and not all of it is entirely to be admired. No, I'm critical about pretty well everybody I write. But yeah, there is that danger.
Okay, I'll let you off.
Let's move.